SNK vs Capcom Card Fighters Clash is the newest release in the Neo Geo Pocket Color Selection series. This is SNK's way to be able to bring some of their classic SNK Pocket Color video games onto modern consoles with high definition displays, new added features, and of course all the nostalgia you can package in just one game. Originally released at the peak of the Neo Geo Pocket Color handheld experience back in 1999, this was the very first crossover from SNK and Capcom that, unlike what is actually known today as the Versus series, back then it was simply just the starting point of a trading card game that ultimately received 3 releases, and it was closer when you actually played it to something like Magic the Gathering. Now, the original release actually had both a SNK version and a Capcom version, and each one started you with a different type of deck, so you can basically obtain brand new and different cards that were only available for that version of the game. Think of it like Pokemon. But then you also had like really rare cards that were only specifically available to that version. So back in the Neo Geo Pocket Color days, you pretty much had to own both versions of the game to be able to have a complete full deck. On the Nintendo Switch release, that is no longer the case. You're actually receiving both versions of the game simultaneously, although each one of them does have their own save file, so you're actually going to be playing 2 separate experiences. You will be able to have the freedom to actually trade back and forth between both versions of the games, so this is actually going to allow you to collect ultimately all the 300 or plus cards that are available in the entirety of both games. Now sadly, this version does not include the Card Fighters Second Expansion Edition, which was actually released later in the Neo Geo Pocket Color series. I believe this was in 2001, so that version of the game is not available here. So all those extra added card, all those extra added features, and even like brand new series that were added, cast of characters and stuff like that, those are not available in this version of the game. Presumably, maybe SNK will eventually try to get that released at some point in the future. Now, at the roots of the experience, if you actually played the Pokemon trading card game back on the Game Boy Color, this game is going to seem very similar to you in just the structure. You're walking around in a little bit of an open environment, you are challenging other players, you're having conversations with them, you're learning about the world itself, about what some of the cards do, some of the rules, some of the abilities that you're actually going to be able to make use of, and eventually have the freedom to be able to challenge any one of these duelists, one of these battlers, into one of the engagements. Your deck will consist of 50 cards in total, which is mixed of character cards and action cards. The key here is that depending on the deck type, which you will have the option to, I believe, save up to 3 different decks, so you can mix and match, and if you do lose to a battler, you'll be able to quickly use one of the other save decks that you have, is to always have some type of balance in your deck. If you have too many action cards, then that means you don't necessarily have enough characters as you draw to be able to make the best use of them and be able to put them in the proper position. But if you have too many character cards, essentially the gameplay is slowed down because you don't have enough actions to be able to take down your enemy as fast as possible. Now, what you actually will be doing is using SP every single time you play a card. SP is gathered essentially as turns pass, and each one of the more powerful cards takes more SP. So, in typical fashion, you cannot play the most powerful cards right away. You're gonna have to wait a little bit. You can take down your opponent's life points, that is kind of the way it works, or you can wait for them to deck out, but that's usually slower. You could also get them to discard cards, you can get them to drop off abilities, or anything along those lines. It's all involving the different strategies that you are going to be building up based off of your deck. Now, visually, when you're walking around the world, like I mentioned before, it reminds me very much of like the Pokemon trading card game on the Game Boy Color, I believe that was. You're walking around from a top-down perspective. All the pixel art is very clean, very beautiful. You're not going to have any issues with that. What is a standout is, of course, the card's art. The card arts is just amazing. It looks great. You're going to have so much nostalgia just looking at some of the characters from both the SNK roster and the Capcom roster. So that's always a great bonus for sure. Now, although the game is mostly played in a single-player environment, you will have the option to eventually play with another person. I'm not necessarily sure if they're also going to need to own a copy of the game. I presume they do. But you will have the option to ultimately play against another player and essentially build up your deck, and they build up theirs, and you get to battle each other. I think the best experience of this game is when you are playing with other people, but of course that really depends on, do your friends actually own a copy of this game? And have they progressed enough to actually have some of the best available cards? Because you definitely, at the end of the game, you'll be needing some really good strategies to be able to take down some of the tougher enemies. Now, the last thing that I'll quickly mention is the additions of the SNK added options. Essentially, what you're going to be looking at here is a couple of filters being added in, a couple of UI HUD additions, and all of this is to pretty much adjust the way that the game is actually going to be looking when you're playing it. You have the option to obviously have an overlaid Neo Geo Pocket Color of any type of color. There's a bunch of color options, or you could just simply have black bars on each side. This is of course based off the aspect ratio. You're not going to have a widescreen option or anything along those lines. Sadly, that's just the way these games used to look, 4:3, so you know, it is what it is. But you can definitely zoom in. If you're playing on like a 4K TV, 50-60 inches, I do think the pixel art is kind of lost because it just blows up way too big on the screen. So there's definitely a right size for the display that you are using. If you are playing this in handheld though, it's gonna just look sharp, perfect, beautiful, especially on the OLED screen. It looks great, so you're never gonna have an issue. This is something that SNK, I've talked about it before in previous reviews for these type of games, have done a great job just showcasing these UI options and added in features that will ultimately make the game a little bit more approachable for other players who are having issues looking at the pixel art, or maybe things just look too tiny for them, so they can definitely take advantage of some of these better options. SNK vs Capcom Card Fighters Clash is one of those classic Neo Geo Pocket Color games that I'm so glad is now finally making its way to modern gen consoles. Of course, you do still have the caveats of the fact that you still are dealing with two separate games. You will be saving from one to the other. You will be having be forced to trade, I guess, from one to the other, and you don't necessarily just have one game where everything is bundled together. That actually probably would have been a much bigger undertaking for SNK, so it is understandable that they chose to go a different route. With that said, they have been great at adding a couple of new things to each one of these games, and ultimately, if you're a fan of the classics, if you're looking to play a couple of rounds by yourself, or ultimately have that nostalgia kick, which ultimately what these games are all about, seeing all those characters again, seeing that experience that is just hasn't necessarily aged at all, is still very much easy to pick up, easy to understand, but with plenty of levels of complexity, because at the end of the day, there's just so many strategies that you're going to be able to utilize where you're taking out characters, and that is something that you're never actually going to be able to probably fully fulfill, just how many ways there actually are to be able to have different encounters with each one of the AI opponents, which again, some of them are pushovers, that's kind of the way they are built, but others are definitely there to give you a challenge. Nintendo Sphere gives SNK vs Capcom Card Fighters Clash on the Nintendo Switch an 8 out of 10. If you're brand new to my channel, be sure to leave a like and subscribe, hit the bell to receive notifications when the videos go up, and as always, thank you so much for watching. See ya.